up guys, it's Brad from Light Architect here. Today I'm excited to do a quick overview of our new KHAOS add-on Destruction Tools for Blender. Destruction Tools is a new addition to our KHAOS Explosion add-on for Blender, where you can now fracture, create rigid body simulations, add constraints to your simulations for more realistic destruction, and then finally, most importantly, add that small scale debris to your rigid body simulation in order to get a much more realistic result. KHAOS Destruction Tools conveniently utilizes cell fracture in addition to Blender's inbuilt rigid body simulation tools in order to streamline your destruction process inside of Blender. I want to give a big thanks to Carlos Barreto, who helped us make this part of the add-on. I'll put a link to some of his social media handles in the description below, so be sure to give him a follow and check out some of his other work as well. But anyways guys, so there are a lot of ways you can destroy things in Blender, and I'm going to make a ton of tutorials using destruction tools to get some really complex and awesome results. However, for this first video, I just want to give a quick overview and just go through a pretty simple destruction process in just destroying this basic wall here using a rigid body simulation, doing some basic constraints, and finally adding those debris particles as well. This is a fairly simple process, and this will be our starting point. I just have this textured concrete wall here. It's just a cube that I've applied a very basic texture to. So as I said, we're just going to be fracturing it, making it a rigid body simulation, constraining it, and then finally adding those debris particles. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is create a ground for the scene here. So our rigid body simulation will have something to fall upon and interact with. So I'll just drag up our concrete wall here and press Shift A. I'll just add a very basic cube, scale it down on the Z axis, and then scale it up here just to create a nice little floor for our simulation. And we want to make sure it's just right below our wall here. All right, so something like this should be pretty good. And I'll also just select our concrete wall here and just drag it off this way so we can have the rigid body simulation kind of fall onto this longer portion of our ground plane here. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is fracture our wall here. So I'll go here to our KHAOS tab. And as you probably know, if you watch this channel, we have lots of different explosion options for you, but we also have some new additions. In addition to the very basic explosion operators here, we also have an ability to add that small scale debris here at the bottom of this first panel. So essentially, these debris fields can be emitted from your rigid bodies. And I'll get to that in a second near the end of this tutorial to show how that works. Then we have here our KHAOS particle parameters, which again are for our standard explosion systems. And then finally, here at the bottom is our destruction tools. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to fracture our wall here. So I'll go ahead and go to our drawing tab here under destruction tools, and I'm going to click on draw fracture place, and automatically the annotation tool will come up for you. And what we can do is we can just draw in a way that we want cell fracture to fracture our object here. So I want the most of our fragments to be in the middle of our concrete wall here, but some on the side as well. So just kind of have fun with it. It's not going to be exact, but it will give you some pretty interesting results depending on how you draw on your object here. So I'm just going to have some fun with it here. I'm going to go with this for the sake of this tutorial. And now what I'm going to do is I'll go back to destruction tools. I'll click on selection box. So now we no longer have our annotation tool selected. You also have the ability to clear your annotation if you want to start over, but I'm going to use this annotation, so we'll leave it like so. And now what we'll do is while our wall here is selected, I'll scroll down here to our fracture tab. And what we can do is under fracture settings, we can access some of our cell fracture properties here. Before you actually fracture your object, you'll want to name the collection of your fractured objects. So I'm just going to leave it at default of KHAOS for the sake of this tutorial. But if you do more complex projects, you'll want to rename different fractured objects different things. But as you can see here, nothing is fractured in our scene right now through our destruction tools panel. But what we'll do is we'll fracture our object from the drawing of our annotation. But I want to actually increase the source limit of our particles first. I think maybe a source limit of 200 will be pretty good for this wall here. That'll give us a lot of detail to play around with different constraints and everything. So I'll go ahead and change this to 200. And then also, if we want to have those secondary smaller chipping particles, we can increase this recursion value. So I might just increase it by 1 just for the sake of this tutorial, and that'll just fracture the fractured particles again once. But anyways, I'll get into more complex variations of this in the future. This should be good for now. So now while our wall is selected here, I'll just click on from drawing, and now as you can see here, cell fracture is fracturing our wall here, and you can see the recursion happening right now, just fracturing everything into smaller segments as well. And you'll notice that where you drew the most with your annotation tool will be the most fractured objects, and then out from there. So this is our fractured object here. As you can see, if you go to the right tab here, you'll notice that destruction tools has added your fractured objects to their own collection. Also, it's created a new collection called KHAOS Original Object, where you also have your original object if you want to go back to that if you get any glitches or anything. So I'll go ahead and disable our original object for now, and you'll also want to turn this off whenever you render. But this is just so you have a backup in case you want to start over again and you didn't get something you like. But anyways, now that we have fractured our wall here, it's time to create a rigid body simulation from this fractured wall. So first we want to select our wall, and this is super easy to do with destruction tools. All you have to do here is just go to the drop down menu here, and you can select your fractured collection of your choice. So as you can see here in our panel, all of these fractured objects are in KHAOS-001, and if you fracture more objects using destruction tools, you'll have more of a drop down menu here. But just to select this one right here, you can select it like that, or you can press the button right here and Blender will select the collection in this drop down menu. So as you can see, if I just select it here, you'll notice that this entire fractured object is selected. So great, now what we want to do is we want to make these rigid bodies. So I'll scroll down here to our active rigid bodies panel, open it up here, and then click on add active. And now as you can see here, if we play through our scene, they're just going to drop like you would expect them to. But as you can see also, our ground plane isn't a collision object yet. So what we want to do is we just want to select our ground plane here, and I'll scroll down here to add passive rigid bodies, and we can choose between simple and complex passive rigid bodies. The only difference between these two is one is going to use a convex hull to create the rigid body, and one is going to use the actual mesh. I'm going to use simple for the sake of this tutorial, but I'll get into this in the future as well. So go ahead and click on simple, and now as you can see here, if we play through our scene, you'll notice that already we have a pretty nice looking rigid body simulation. Now for this tutorial, what I want to do is I want to crash an object through this wall here. So obviously we want to deactivate these rigid bodies until that happens. So what we can do here is, once again, we can select all of our fractured objects in this collection by just clicking on the select button here. And then what I want to do is I want to click on the start deactivated button right here. And now all of these objects that are selected will start deactivated, and nothing will happen right off the bat until we add something to hit them. So now let's create that collision object to hit them. So what I like to do is, generally I like to use an icosphere and push it through this wall here. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A, I'll add an icosphere, and I'll just put it off to the side here, and I'll have it start off over here at frame 1 of our simulation. I'll press I, add a location, rotation, and scale keyframe, and then on maybe frame 40, I'll just keyframe it over here on the x-axis through our wall, and press I again, add a location, rotation, and scale keyframe. And now what we want to do is we want to make this an active animated rigid body, so that we'll actually interact with our fractured rigid body wall here. So as you can see here, if I play through our scene, nothing is going to happen right now, but as soon as I select our icosphere here and click on add active animated, you'll notice that now we have a pretty awesome little rigid body simulation. And our rigid body simulation is deactivated until this icosphere hits the wall there. Alright, so there are a lot of other things we can play around with here. One thing we can do is actually go ahead and select our fractured wall here, and you can scroll down here and change the mass of all of your objects in this selection. So say we want to use concrete here, so go ahead and click on concrete, and if we go to our physics tab, the mass of each individual object will change depending on the relative size of the object. So as you can see here, there's a slight difference in the rigid body simulation already by doing that. So you can definitely play around with different things here. The main thing is the mass. Also, by default, the rigid body shape of all of your objects here will be in the convex hull format. And the reason for that is because we found that that's the most stable way for these simulations to work in Blender. If you change it to mesh, as you can see here, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. As you can see, it's not really acting quite as stable as it was originally. So we recommend you actually just use the convex hull option most of the time, like so, and you'll get a much nicer looking result. And also, Blender will calculate the simulation much faster. Anyways, now that we have a basic rigid body simulation, it's time to tweak a few of the settings here. The first thing I'm going to do is select our icosphere, and I'm just going to maybe make the animation last a little bit longer. So I'll just select one of the keyframes here at the bottom and just make our icosphere not move quite as quickly here. We'll try that out. And I'm liking that a little bit better. It's a little less explosive, but you know, we can actually see what we're getting a bit nicer. The next thing we're going to do is actually constrain our fractured object here. So as you can see here, if we scroll down to the bottom of our destruction tools panel, go ahead and close some of these windows here. As you can see here at the very bottom, we have a little constraints tab. So go ahead and open that up, and we can select the fractured object. And whenever you click this, whatever the object you have selected in the drop-down menu here will be selected. It's pretty simple to add constraints. Let's say what we want to do is constrain these bottom fractured pieces to the ground plane here. So what I can do is I can just start selecting some of these ground pieces here. And I can be a little bit sloppy with it. And I maybe also might select some of these on the side just for the sake of this tutorial, like so. And I'll also select our ground plane here. And then I'll just click on Create Constraint. And now, as you can see here, if you go under your KHAOS-001 collection, you'll have a new collection with all of these constraints in them. And as you can see here, if we play through our scene here, you'll notice that these objects that we have selected and constrained are actually being constrained to our ground plane here. And this is going to be a much more realistic result. In fact, I'm not sure I'm going to change anything after this. But now you can repeat this process with as many constraints as you like, depending on the power of your computer, obviously. But if you ever want to adjust some constraints, you can, of course, just select them like this in the drop-down menu, and all the constraints in that collection will be selected. And then of course you can adjust the breakable option as well as the threshold for that constraint. So let's say perhaps we want this constraint to break. We can click on the breakable option while these constraints are selected, and now as you can see here, they'll actually break when a certain amount of force is applied to them. So if we don't want these to break quite as easily, we can increase the threshold to say maybe 1,000. And now as you can see here, well, they still break pretty quickly. So let's try maybe 10,000. And there we go. See, now this constraint will only break if the force passes 10,000. That's how you can use the breakable threshold. I'm going to leave it like this for now because I think it's looking pretty cool. One more thing I might do just to show you how we can add another constraint to this system is I might just constrain some of these fractured objects in the middle of our simulation. So it's like a larger piece in addition to the smaller chunks being blasted away here. So as you can see, all of these kind of separate as soon as the icosphere hits it. So what we want to do is just maybe combine some of these so there are some larger chunks as well. So I'll just maybe just select a bunch of these pieces here so there's a little larger chunk here. And again, feel free to play around with it, but now that we've selected all these different fractured objects here, we can create a new constraint. So I'll go ahead and click on Create, and now as you can see here in our KHAOS-001 collection, you'll have a second constraint collection, and you can also select each individual constraint in the drop-down menu. So say you want to adjust the first constraint you added where we've attached some of the fractured objects along the side and bottom of our fractured object, you can just select it here and adjust our threshold and breakable settings. Or if you want to adjust the one we just added, we can just select the constraint 2, and those will be selected, and you can adjust those separately in this panel as well. So as you can see here, after our second constraint is added, not much has changed, and that's I think because there's just so much force hitting those objects that it's just breaking that constraint as soon as the icosphere hits it. So what I'm going to do for this specific constraint, I'm just going to deselect the breakable option. So I'll go ahead and deselect that. So now as you can see, there's this big chunk being broken off in our simulation as well, which is going to just add some nice variation to our destruction. So awesome. Now I'm pretty happy with this specific wall simulation. However, as you can see here, if I go to rendered view, you'll notice that while this is looking pretty awesome, it's not looking as realistic as it should be. Now, as you can see here, there is an inner material for our fractured object, which we can change very easily in our materials tab. As you can see, you can change the chaos in fracture material and change this darker material that's the inner part of your fracture. So we can of course change that, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to skip over that because that's just a very basic material adjustment. What I want to show you is how you can add small scale debris to this simulation super easily to add that realistic look. So this is what I found to be the key to creating large scale destruction. So what we're going to do is we're going to find the moment where the icosphere starts to break our concrete wall here. So I'll just kind of scroll through here frame by frame, and I think about frame 28 is where our destruction starts to happen. So on this frame, what we want to do is we want to select the fractured objects that we want to add small scale debris to. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and turn off our constraints in our viewport option. So I'll go ahead and turn these off just so we don't end up selecting them by accident. And I'll also select our icosphere and turn that off as well, just so we can select only our fractured objects here. So what I'll do is I'll press B and I'll just select the innermost pieces here of our simulation, just like that. And I accidentally selected our ground plane, so I'll press Shift and select this one as well. Go ahead and turn that off. And then I want to make one of these fractured objects our active object, so I'll press Shift and select one once more. And now what we want to do is we want to add that small scale debris at frame 28 to create that realism. So I'll scroll up here to our original KHAOS procedural explosions tab, and we have a variety of small scale debris to choose from. For this example, I'm going to use the rocks debris as well as the glass particles. Even though the glass particles don't really make sense to add to the simulation, I think it's just a nice touch, and you can see the variation in the debris fields that you're adding. So I'll select the glass particles as well as the rocks checkbox. Now I'll scroll down here to Destruction Tools Debris and click on Add Debris. And right off the bat, you'll think that nothing has happened. However, what's going to happen once you play the simulation, start from the beginning here, is as soon as the icosphere hits the object, small scale debris is going to emit from those selected particles, which is going to give you a much more realistic result. Now, in my opinion, there's quite a bit of rocks and some of them are a little bit big. So what we can do is just select one of the rocks with the particle system on it, and I'll go to the particle system tab here in Blender. And as you can see here, we have two different particle systems on our object here. And these two particle systems are on all of those selected objects. So whenever we change the rock or the glass particle system, it's going to change throughout the entire simulation. So what I can do is first I'll select our rock particle explosion. And one thing I'm noticing here is that there are just a little bit too many rocks for my taste in this particle system. So in our rock particle system settings here, I'm just going to bring down the number to say maybe 60. And now we'll try it out again here. And I think that's looking a little bit nicer, a little bit more subtle, I would say. We could also go to our render settings here and increase the size of our rocks, but I think probably 0.1 is about right. And then we can do the same thing for our glass particles. So maybe we want more or less glass particles. I think, let's see here. I'm not sure how much our glass is actually doing here. Our glass is much smaller. Might just increase the size of it a little bit. You know, something like that is pretty nice. So this is kind of where you can start controlling how much debris you want in it. You know, I think this is a little bit much for our glass as far as size goes, so maybe 0.13 or even 0.1 maybe, something like that. And at this point, it's just a matter of adjusting those settings to get the right amount of debris for your system. So maybe increase the number of glass particles here, since they're going to be much smaller. It might serve us to have a little bit more of them. Yeah, that's looking pretty nice. But it's just a nice way you can add that small scale debris to your rigid body simulation for a more realistic result. And as you can see here, if I go to rendered view, in my opinion, adding that small scale debris with the glass and rocks is giving us a lot more detail to work with, and it's just going to give a much more photorealistic result if you're trying to combine this with a live action shot. If you ever want to remove these smaller scale debris systems from your objects, all you have to do is just select all the objects that have that debris on them and then click on this remove debris box here, and one by one your particle systems will be removed. So for example, if you have two particle systems, you have to click it twice. But anyways, that's how you can remove those small scale debris particle systems if you want to start off again from that point. But anyways, guys, that is a little intro to KHAOS destruction tools. Of course, you do want to bake your rigid body simulation as well as your small scale debris particle systems. There are several ways to do that. For one, you can go to your particle tab here with one of the self-fractured objects that has your particle system on it, and you can just go to bake all dynamics and click on that little box there, and Blender will go through all of your frames and calculate both your rigid body simulation as well as your particle systems simulation here. As you can see now, we can go to any part of our simulation, and we don't have to start from the beginning to see what we're looking like. Another way to do that is by going to our scene properties tab here, and then under rigid body world, you can go to the cache tab and you can delete the bake all dynamics again. However, I don't think this way will bake the particle system as well, so you might have to do the particle system separately in its own tab. So I generally just go to the particle system tab here with that particle system selected and then just bake all dynamics. But anyways, guys, that is it for this video. I hope it was helpful. Lots more tutorials using KHAOS destruction tools very soon. I'm going to be showing you how to destroy streets, bridges, all kinds of really cool stuff using this add-on so you can get really awesome realistic results. As always, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Let us know what you'd like to see next, or if you have any suggestions on how to improve this add-on in the future, we'll definitely take that into consideration as well. I'll see you next time.